Welcome, Minister Michael Wood from New Zealand for the launch of the Global Labour Resilience Index. It's a pleasure to have you here today. And we want to talk about the experience of New Zealand in labour market resilience. And in particular, New Zealand has done relatively well. It's ranked 23rd out of 131 countries in this year's Global Labour Resilience Index. Could you elaborate on the policies you've undertaken to support labour market resilience in New Zealand?
Well, thank you, Anthony. And yes, we were very pleased by that ranking and by some of the insights that were offered as a part of how that ranking was determined. New Zealand had strong foundations coming into the COVID-19 pandemic, but I think what has probably particularly driven our relatively high ranking has been the cyclical response, which was especially high relative to the structural factors. And I think there are a few key things that are probably important within that. One simply was the effectiveness of New Zealand's health response in dealing with the pandemic, which meant that while we had in the initial period some of the tightest and most disruptive lockdowns of any jurisdiction, they were very short and they were very effective, which has meant that through much of the year, we've been able to have an internal economy that's continued to operate at close to normal conditions, and our relative levels of stringency in terms of restrictions on business and labour market operation have been quite low. So that's been very much, I think, at the core of things for us this year. But then particularly looking at some of the labour market responses that we've had to the unprecedented conditions of 2020, 2021, I'd identify a couple of things. The first is that we have had an active government response to engage with business and to provide support to people. So we had a significant wage subsidy scheme. We've had ongoing targeted sectoral support in parts of the economy that have been more affected than others. We've had very active labour market policies in terms of providing free trades training and apprenticeships to young people, for example. We've had support coming through our transfer system, which has supported people to set up new small businesses or to support employers to retain employees that they otherwise would not have been able to retain. And probably within that, I think one of the things that was most important and that we've had feedback from business around has been the speed of the response that we as government provided. So very quickly at the point about this time last year, when we went into a lockdown period, we very quickly stood up a substantial wage subsidy scheme that meant that we didn't have weeks or months going along where firms were having to dig into reserves and potentially run out of them. So we were able to, a core aspect of that wage subsidy scheme wasn't just the substitution of income, it was about retaining the link between employee and the employer through a very difficult period. So we didn't have significant employment displacement at the beginning that we had to come back and fix up later. We retained the link to a very great degree throughout, which has meant that our unemployment rate in total has only risen by about 1% to date. The other couple of key things I'd say is we had a very high premium on different sectors working together. So we had a very strong relationship between our social partners, our key business organisations and our unions. And as government, we work with them in a tripartite way to work through solutions, to get real-time information coming back so that we can adapt what we are doing as government. And that's something we did through the course of the year. We constantly reviewed policies for their effectiveness and changed things. So for example, we had what we called a COVID leave support scheme to enable employers to receive some financial support if employees had to be off work for a period of time to self-isolate. And that the feedback we received through our engagement was that that was not meeting the need of employees who had to stay away from work for a shorter period of time for getting tested. And so we adapted and changed that scheme to be able to meet that need. So that constant feedback and dialogue with business unions, workers has really been, I think, an important part of our response. And more broadly, the idea that people did need to work together and support one another. So we had a lot of dialogue, for example, mostly successful, not always, but mostly with commercial landlords about what government's expectations would be about how they would be behaving towards their business tenants when those business tenants might be in significantly financially straitened times. And there are other examples of sector engagement we've had where we've, as government, not necessarily changed the law, but really worked with sectors and encouraged them to be responsive to ensure that employment and business conditions are retained. And I think probably the other thing that has helped throughout this period, and it's identified in a number of your measures, has been the relative ease of doing business in New Zealand. We rank number one on a number of those measures here. It's extremely easy to set up a business, to get yourself going. And I think while there hasn't been a huge amount of business creation over the course of this year, that probably has helped as we've moved things along as well.
Thank you, Minister. Yeah, there's a number of remarkable things New Zealand has done here. I mean, you're citing actually good practices which are highlighted in the Global Labour Resilience Index. Among them, the speed of the response to a crisis. Among them, as well, having the fundamentals in place, such as effective and attractive business climate, and that interaction between different stakeholders. So having a great consultation, if you want, between the stakeholders to move forward. Now, this said, the GLRI 2021 highlights across the world, so not specific to New Zealand, some vulnerabilities, if you want, in labour markets, which were even more striking in the context of the COVID crisis. And in particular, there are vulnerable segments related to women, so the gender equality in the labour force, women who had a stronger, let's say, hit from COVID, to the youth, and so greater youth unemployment, more difficulty with jobs, and even a third, which is particular types of employment, such as gig employment, which has risen in many countries and basically was much less protected. Would you have any observations here on these particular segments and what New Zealand has done in that area?
Yes, you're right in highlighting some of those inequalities that play out across the labour market, and that is the same in New Zealand as it is in many other countries, and that's something that we are acutely aware of. And of course, one of the things that happens is when some kind of a crisis or shock to the system occurs, it tends to be those more vulnerable groups who are already disadvantaged who disproportionately bear the brunt of any economic shock and dislocation. So that's something that we have been very conscious of through the year as we have been monitoring the situation in New Zealand and tailoring our response as government. We have, similar to other countries, inequalities in respect of gender, real vulnerabilities in terms of youth unemployment, and we also have particular vulnerabilities and inequalities in terms of Māori and Pacific community levels of unemployment and vulnerabilities within the labour market as well. So probably the first thing I would just say, and I think this is important, is you don't know these things unless you're watching them closely. And so across the course of our response to COVID-19, this has always been one of the things in the headlights for government ministers. We have a group of government ministers who work together closely on education, employment and training issues, who meet regularly, who monitor these things, and who actively think about our ongoing policy settings and response. So we've been making sure that it is front and centre for us, and the political character of our Labour government is that it's very important for us that we reduce those inequalities in the labour market and our society more generally. So we've had a range of responses to that. Perhaps just sort of starting with some of the longer term responses. If we look at gender inequalities in our labour market, for example, we've had increasing rates of female participation across the labour market, still not at quite at the levels of equity that we would wish to do, but the broad long-term story there has been positive in terms of stronger female participation in the sector, which certainly helps in terms of reducing income inequality on a gender basis. But we do still know, as many countries do, that we have had this persistent gender pay gap for some time. So over the last couple of years, we have introduced new gender pay equity legislation, which gives a specific mechanism in different sectors for gender pay claims to be able to be raised, and on an evidence-based tripartite basis to be able to work through those and reach settlements which ensure that we start to remove those gender inequality issues that have plagued us for far too long. Similarly, over the last couple of years, our government has moved to increase access to paid parental leave It was only New Zealand was one of only a few countries into the early 2000s that didn't even have a paid parental leave scheme. It was brought in by the last time our Labor government was in power in the early 2000s, and we've extended it to 6 months paid parental leave over the last couple of years, which brings it more into line with international norms, and I think is going to be quite a significant part of ensuring that women are able to play their part in the labour market in a more equitable way, because we know that that's one of the points at which obviously women fall out if they don't have adequate support at that time of their lives. We've had other responses over the course of last year to really try and deal with some of those groups who are particularly affected by shocks, such as youth, Māori and Pacific, in the context of the New Zealand economy. I'm very much aware, as you said, that oftentimes those workers are people who are more likely to be in the casualised sorts of roles, the gig economy, have lost less job security, and also potentially more likely to be in sectors that are more disproportionately hit than other sectors when there's an economic shock of the kind that we have with COVID. So that's why those active labour market policies have been really important. So for example, the free trades training and apprenticeship policy that we brought in around about the middle of last year, which has complemented a range of other very targeted measures to particularly support young people, Māori and Pacific, in the labour market, I think have been really, really important. And they have meant that even when we haven't been able to prevent job loss, that we've been able to very quickly connect with those people, retain their relative levels of income, and help support or transition them into sectors where there are jobs. Because the nature of the jobs hit in New Zealand is that we have had some sectors who have been very badly affected. We actually continue to have a range of sectors where we have significant labour shortages. And so government has had to play a very important role in terms of connecting up displaced workers with employers and sectors where actually there may be a win-win opportunity by bringing people together. And we consider that to be a very important part of our response. So I think those are probably the key things, but so a lot of good cyclical work that we have done over the last year, which has been relatively effective. We still do have an unemployment gap between the average and those groups that I just identified, but it's in relative terms, it hasn't increased as much as we feared at the beginning of the year. But there's still a lot of ongoing work in terms of the structural nature of our labour markets to make sure that we continue to close those inequalities.
Thank you, Minister. Very clear. I think one thing that was highlighted also from this crisis is the whole importance of active labour market policies, and I think you mentioned it right there. We just can't leave it all to free markets. There are some economic sometimes deficiencies, let's call it that, which need to be remedied. And so some of the examples you give related to women, related to Maoris in the gig economy are definitely extremely relevant here. Now, looking forward, we always like to look forward to the future. The Global Labour Resilience Index identifies 3 phases of country response. The first phase is the short-term absorption of the crisis, which you referred to in the first question. The second is the recovery, so getting back to the initial stage where we were in the labour force, in the labour market. And the third is what we call transformation. And that's basically building on the lessons from the crisis and looking to actually have stronger and more resilient labour markets in the future. Considering that future, the transformation phase, where would you see priorities for New Zealand today, going forward, looking at 3 to 5 years from now?
Well, it is nice to feel as of March 2021 that we might at least be in that recovery phase and be able to start looking ahead. Whereas, of course, for so many countries over the last year, it has been simply getting through. And as we've sometimes described it, building the plane as we fly it to try and get through the particular crisis conditions that we face. So being in a recovery phase is important, but I think what you say is very valid, that it's a good time to start lifting our sights to ongoing transformation and reflecting on the last year and perhaps some of the weaknesses or challenges that it's exposed, or perhaps some of the new thinking that it has brought forward to enable us to build more sustainable labour markets, to be building more resilient labour markets in every respect. So coming out of that period, a few key priorities for me and our government. The first one really is reflecting back on the last year, and regardless of how well different countries have done relative to one another, everyone has been impacted to some degree or another, and we've all seen distressing impacts on the communities in our countries because of this crisis. And the reality is that we know as we move forward, we will continue to have to navigate economic cycles. There will be future crises. There will be periods of heightened unemployment due to conditions that are beyond anyone's control at different points. So what do we do to build ongoing resilience and to, as much as possible, reduce the social consequences of those periods of dislocation for people and for communities? We have very much buried in our consciousness here in New Zealand, we had a period of significant and very fast economic restructuring that occurred in the 1980s and 90s, sort of in a more concentrated, dramatic fashion than most countries who did it more gently over a longer period. And we, to some degree in New Zealand, still bear the social consequences of the significant unemployment and social dislocation created by that. So one of the things that's a priority for us is thinking about, when we do have periods, as we have over the last year, how do we prevent wage scarring? How do we ensure that people are able to adapt as soon as possible? How do we ensure that whole communities aren't uprooted and that we don't have serious social consequences from these short or medium term economic disruption? So that's a piece of work that we have going on in a range of different ways. It looks at things, for example, like how do we embed good quality active labour market policies? How would we perhaps better ensure continuity of income for people, so that if we do have these shocks for individuals, that there isn't such a dramatic hit on their earnings, that their lives are entirely disrupted and communities entirely uprooted. And so we have work going on there. So that broader issue about how we deal with shocks in the future, something we've always known we need to think about, but that's been obviously heightened for us given the experience of COVID-19. Secondly, I would say that piece around that we just spoke about in terms of reducing inequalities across our labour markets and more broadly in our society, that's very important for our government here in New Zealand. We have those disparities between groups that I recognise. We have disparities, like most people, between regions as well. And actually that's been an important part of our response this time, has been quick investment into regions that might have suffered depressive economic conditions, to make sure that we've been able to replace displaced jobs very quickly through short-term shovel-ready infrastructure investment. But more broadly, thinking about that equity piece, New Zealand has one of the more deregulated labour markets in the world, and that has led to, yes, some efficiencies, but also significant inequalities. And so one of the things our government is looking at is how do we make sure that we have a more equitable labour market in which the gains that we make through productivity are more equitably shared with labour than they have been over the last 30 years in our country. And we have a range of legislative responses that we're planning to move forward with over the next year or so to ensure that we get there, notably the recreation of a form of sector bargaining, which we have largely lacked in New Zealand over the last 30 years as compared to other countries. And look, the third one I would identify is the ongoing challenge of ensuring that we increase productivity across our labour market. Our record in this area hasn't been as strong as we would wish it to be over the last 40 years, in fact, and that is a significant challenge if we want to drive ongoing prosperity and be able to share the fruits of that prosperity well across people in our country. And one of the things that I believe, my party, my government believes, is that that point and the one I've just mentioned before are to some degree linked. That if you have a low road in terms of wages and skills, and you simply have a model which supports increased profitability of firms through a lowering of costs, then you disincentivise the investments in plant and machinery and research and development, the growth of export markets, all of those things that actually drive long-run productivity and good economic conditions for everyone. So we've very much got a high road vision for investing in skills, training, supporting a high skill, high wage labour market, and we'll be putting in place a range of policies to support that vision as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Minister, for these insights on New Zealand's approach to labour market resilience. And we're looking forward to seeing an improved path, even beyond the 21st place in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.